internal surveillance system of the Labour Party was conspiring to lose the election. We underestimated those functions of the establishment.
The Electronic Intifada.
The Electronic Intifada.
The Electronic Intifada.
This is the Electronic Intifada Podcast. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman.
And I'm Asa and Stanley. Joining us today, we're super excited to have Lowkey. Welcome to the EI Podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's really special to be here. Electronic Intifada, since the heyday of pro-Palestinian expression on the internet 10 years ago, Electronic Intifada has been a real bastion and has been an important site for so many of us in understanding what is happening. And long may Electronic Intifada continue.
Thank you. And Lowkey is one of the most important rappers in Britain today. He's had massive success as a hip-hop MC. He could have gone mainstream and accepted a deal with a major record label, but instead he's chosen to stay independent, giving him the freedom to talk about whatever he wants in his lyrics. And he's renowned for his unmatched lyricism as much as for his politics. His first Fire in the Booth from 2010 has more than 6 million YouTube views. Lowkey has always used his music to support the things that he believes in, not least the cause of Palestinian liberation. His most famous tracks include Long Live Palestine, Ahmed, Terrorist, and Obama Nation.
If Ibrahim Abu Thureya could resist without a wheelchair, 10-year challenge, tell Regev we are still here. Until that killing Netanyahu, he should feel fear. The old live through us and guarantee the children will care. Criminal, not invincible, and you know it. Samadoun, still sitting in their stoic. May not feel us with you when you listen to our poems. You inspire humanity, your resistance is heroic.
We've been trying to get you on the podcast for ages, and finally the stars aligned, and you're here. Thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you for the very kind introduction as well.
Yeah, well, we meant all of it, you know. So
thank you, man.
We've been, you know, you were very generous with your introduction to us, and we've been fans of yours for a long time as well. So, yeah, the feeling is mutual. Let's start off with a topical question. On the issue of the kind, there's really what's happening in academia in this country, and what's happening is essentially the smear campaign. That's really it's really a continuation of the smear campaign that was happening in politics, has moved over to academia and has moved over to trying to get David Miller fired. So as you know, most of our viewers will know, David Miller is a researcher at Bristol University. He's a professor of sociology, and he's published research and reports on lobbies and on PR and things like that. And one of the lobbies that he's researched is the Israel lobby, and they are now trying to get him fired, essentially. So, what's your take on what's happening at the University of Bristol at the moment?
Well, as you correctly put it, it's an extension of what happened in the political sphere during the glitch in the matrix, which was the Jeremy Corbyn leadership of the Labour Party. Obviously, Corbyn being conspired against by, on one side, the British establishment and on the other side, foreign actors, was not the aberration of history. You saw Harold Wilson being plotted against by the intelligence services also previously. So the parameters of political choice in the country are extremely narrow. And we see that with the Keir Starmer and his clear support also for Israel. You know, where we're talking about something with the academic side of things is we're seeing the pressure to accept the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, but especially with somebody like David, and I would, really like to state my absolute solidarity with him. He has a legacy of so much brilliant and important work, which I think far more people in British society need to be aware of and acquainted with, because it could teach them so much about the way power functions. And one of the things, sorry, you're still muted.
David Miller's research, more people need to know about it, essentially.
Absolutely, more people need to know about it. And, you know, Electronic Intifada has done a stellar job of supporting David, as few others have done. But I think there's one aspect of what he said that he hasn't been adequately defended on, unfortunately. And that is the involvement of pro-Zionist organizations and actors with the Islamophobia industry. Now, if you were to ask people in this country who the main proponents within the last decade or so of Islamophobia have been, they would certainly say Tommy Robinson and Katie Hopkins. If you were to say that Tommy Robinson's Free Tommy campaign was funded by Middle East Forum, you know, this is also functions as a think tank and was quoted 13 times by Anders Breivik in his manifesto. Middle East Forum, the director of it, is a gentleman by the name of Greg Roman. He was an employee of the Israeli Ministry of Defense and of the Israeli Foreign Ministry. Lucy Brown, a former employee of Tommy Robinson, said that he was receiving £10,000 per month from Robert Shillman as part of his Shillman Fellowship at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. Well, who is Robert Shillman? He was on the board of directors for the Friends of the IDF. The Shillman Foundation also funds the Friends of the IDF, the Christians United for Israel, the Jewish National Fund, and the Zionist Organization of America. Robert Shillman is identified as, through his foundation, funding organizations involved in the building of Israeli settlements. We know that Tommy Robinson also went to the West Bank and the Golan Heights and posed on the back of an IDF tank. He later publicly stated that he would fight for Israel in a war. This was an aspect of the Tommy Robinson phenomenon that wasn't adequately dealt with by mainstream media in any way, shape, or form. He was backed materially by people that see themselves as Zionists and actively support Zionist colonization and ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian. Katie Hopkins, you know, let's not forget that she took a trip to the David Horowitz Freedom Center in 2017 and said, we must arm ourselves. She also worked for Rebel Media, which is funded by the Middle East Forum and Robert Shillman, and advocated for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. On a personal note, in regards to Katie Hopkins, there's a 2014 interview with her in The Guardian in which she states that after leaving college, she signed a 35-year contract with British military intelligence. She trained at Sandhurst and claims that the only reason that she isn't today in the British Army is because she has epilepsy. But it's actually far wider than Katie Hopkins and Tommy Robinson. They are not aberrations. As has been delved into by Sarah Marusek in her chapter in David's book with Tom Mills and others, What is Islamophobia? You find that 75% of the organizations that fund the global Islamophobia network, we're talking about think tanks like the Henry Jackson Society, we're talking about the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, we are talking about Memory, even is identified as part of the global Islamophobia network. So 75% of the organizations that fund them also fund the building of Israeli settlements, which are illegal according to UN Resolution 2334. Sheldon Adelson, of course, you know, was famous for his support for Israeli colonization, giving over $83 million over a 4-year period and $25 million to Ariel University on occupied territory in the West Bank. He funded Birthright Israel, he funded Christians United for Israel, the JNF, and the Zionist Organization of America. But he also funded Memory. He also funded Foundation for Defense of Democracies and Camera, well-known Zionist organizations.
These are all organizations linked directly to the state of Israel. So, like, for example, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies is known to, be linked to the Ministry of Strategic Affairs and to coordinate its activities to Israel's Ministry of Strategic Affairs, the anti-BDS ministry, as was revealed in the Al Jazeera film. I think this is a really good point that you're making, that these Islamophobic forces, these anti-Muslim agitators, right-wing, I would argue fascist agitators like Tommy Robinson and Katie Hopkins, they do get this kind of material support from pro-Israel organizations, Zionist organizations, and organizations that are explicitly directly linked to the state of Israel, or sort of quasi-statal bodies at least. I think it's a really important point that you're making, and it is a large part of the reason why David Miller has been targeted in this way.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that unfortunately it's been a real, you can't call it a blind spot because it's not by accident, but when the Robert Shillman funding of Tommy Robinson came out, he was dealt with as just a neocon, and I had to go on the Friends of the IDF website and look at their archives to find that he was on the board of directors previously. So this relationship was never really seriously problematized in a meaningful way. There's others like Paul E. Singer Foundation, also funders of Friends of the IDF, the Israel Independence Fund, and simultaneously funding Birthright Israel, but also the NGO Monitor in Jerusalem and Memory too. And an interesting by the by about Paul E. Singer, is that not only being the second largest donor to the Republicans, he is also the boss of Elliott Management, which is an organization that is the largest shareholder in Arconic, the construction company that made the cladding on Grenfell. Paul E. Singer, through Elliott Management, is also a major donor to the Conservative Party and Boris Johnson. Now, an interesting crossover is that Arconic, not only making killer cladding that killed people in Latimer Road, the Arconic also got the contract for the F-35 to build it with Lockheed Martin and BAE Systems. And we know how important the threat of the F-35 has been in terms of, Netanyahu giving a speech in front of it, threatening Iran. It's quite horrific when you see the true picture of how power is able to reproduce itself and how interests overlap and cross over. But just that point on the David Miller is that I think that link between the building of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, illegal settlements, and the Islamophobia industry, unfortunately, that point has not been made firmly and assertively enough.
And another facet of, the kind of the breadth of work that the Israel lobby and Islamophobia industries are involved in is also censorship, and working with private companies like, YouTube and Facebook, Zoom, to crack down on freedom of speech, to really, specifically targeting speech about Palestine and Palestinian liberation. We've reported a lot on the Silicon Valley monopolies and their increasing cracking down on freedom of speech, especially, on Palestine. How have you seen this affect your work on Spotify and YouTube, for example? How do you see the certain, this current manipulation of algorithms and and censorship kind of affecting your work?
Well, I mean, mainly it's a Facebook question for me. I think the YouTube side of things is harder to pin down, but there are some signs in that regard. In terms of Facebook, obviously, we know that the cyber unit in the Israeli army as of 2015 has worked heavily on getting accounts deleted, getting posts deleted. Unit 8200 has, been looking at people's posts and working out how they're sort of algorithmatizing how likely they would be to become collaborators. We've seen Facebook generally acquiescent to those requests that come to them from the Israeli state. But in terms of me personally, I think a period of time where perhaps we were not vigilant enough was the fake news push that we saw. Now, rather than and we often see this, problems are either presented or in some cases manufactured, but then the answer to that problem which is offered always taps right but smashes left.
Yeah.
And what you saw was the push of an idea that Facebook in 2016 somehow had an anti-conservative bias. Well, how was that dealt with? Towards the end of the first year of Trump's time in office, there were major decisions being made within Facebook about trusted sources. Now, if you were seen to be too clearly partisan, then you would suffer because you would not be seen as a neutral or objective form of news. Mm-hmm. Now, Mother Jones had an investigation whereby they found that internally, a site like the Daily Wire, hosting Ben Shapiro, was actually benefiting from Facebook's new understanding of trustworthy sources, but a site like Mother Jones was suffering, and they put it clearly at the door of Facebook's Washington office, Vice President of Global Public Policy, Joel Kaplan. Supposedly, he had set about to make sure that the algorithm would favor more conservative sources of news, whether that be Fox News or Ben Shapiro or the Daily Caller, who in 2018, he tried to bring in as one of Facebook's fact-checking partners. So what Mother Jones reported was they saw a loss of around $600,000 because of that. In the first 6 months after the change in 2016, 2017, they saw a 37% drop in engagement on their page. However, if you were to look at Tommy Robinson, at the Daily Wire, at the Daily Caller, at Breitbart, at Fox News during that period, they were continuing to come on in leaps and strides. In my case, I can say this. My Facebook page, despite regularly being posted upon, since 2016 has not grown. So in 2016, it had 150,000 followers on it. In 2021, my Facebook page has 150,000 followers on it. Now, in that period of time, there's been releases that have gone out through the page that have got 1 million views, videos that have got 1 million views. There's been YouTube videos that have got 1 million views. There's been interview with Noam Chomsky. There's been an interview with Ilhan Omar. There's been many different things that could have attracted traffic. And just to bear in mind that my Facebook page between the year of 2009, to 2011 went from 0 to 180,000. When I reactivated it in 2016, inexplicably, it was just at 150,000. And as I say, in a period of 5 years, that number has not moved. In terms of the YouTube thing, it's still in the same name of emphasizing trustworthy news sources, but also there's the added element of YouTube as of the appointment of a new head of music there in 2017, who I don't really want to get into who he is, but he is also pro-Israeli and has written articles to that effect and is Israeli. He said clearly, before I came to YouTube, Google were treating record labels as their enemies. When I came in, I made it clear to YouTube that we needed to treat these major labels, and he incidentally had just come from working for record labels his entire career. We had to treat them as clients. And so what you then see is a more a relationship of mutual interest between record labels. And don't forget that YouTube deleted 2 billion fake views belonging to Universal Records in 2012. So by the time this new head of music came in, and to be honest with you, I don't mind saying it, the CEO of Universal, Lucian Grange, donates to the Friends of the Israel Defense Forces.
Yeah.
So, we're in a bit of a bind here, people. If we're completely honest,
I think that's a bit of an understatement.
If you want to take it back further regarding the internet, Yasha Levine in his book Surveillance Valley, his assertion and conviction is that the internet, when it was originally built as the ARPANET, following US humiliating defeat and delicious defeat in Vietnam, they designed the internet, the ARPANET, in order to deal with future counterinsurgencies and to deal with domestic subversives. In fact, you found at the universities where the internet was being developed, the ARPANET as it was called at that time, you saw occupations and protests against it because people were saying it would be hugely detrimental to people's rights. And so now what we're really in is a sort of battle for digital self-determination. Yeah. Our information is being used for so many things and so many experiments, hundreds and hundreds of experiments. 5,000 character points about you. If I was to ask you, Asa, to give me 5,000 sentences that start with I am, you probably couldn't do it unless you're a narcissist, which I don't think you are, right? Now, the thing is that this is the function of these contraptions to build up those 5,000 data points. Now, those points of character are being purchased hundreds, if not thousands of times a day in deals that we have absolutely no rights to, that we don't know who it's being sold to, and we don't know what it's being used for. And that's the real thing that's happening with our information today due to the internet. Now, when you've got governments like the British or US or Israeli governments, or most governments in general, what do you think they're really going to use that information for? What's happening with that information? Who's regulating?
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, we are the product, right?
Yeah.
Precisely.
As users of this stuff. And I think battle for digital self-determination is a really good way to put it. So let's talk about the record industry a little bit. So recently you had Daily Duppy, congratulations, and you got 500,000 views. Perhaps
Explain what that is to our non-YouTube.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. You'll explain it better.
No, well, Daily Duppy historically was just a person rapping to a camera on what used to be called Grand Daily, but then was renamed GRM Daily. But then it has become a very slick sort of program, you could say, on their YouTube channel, where they animate the lyrics to whatever the person.
They add visual effects to your
cool.
rap.
They add visual, and you know something actually on that topic that we just said. Now, people may not know this. Well, you may know this as people involved with a YouTube channel, but you know you can pay YouTube to algorithmically favor your song. Okay, so it can put it as a suggested song. After the next song, it can put it as a video before the other video. We tried with the Daily Duppy, right, to turn it into an advert. Do you know what YouTube said?
Thanks, but no thanks.
It said thanks, but no thanks, because it contains shocking content.
Shocking content.
Shocking content.
Well, that's bizarre. I mean, I've watched that a few times now. You don't use, I mean, you never really use any curse words in your, your music.
What was their definition of shocking?
Yeah,
they didn't elaborate, but I think it's probably linked to the Boris Johnson, the clip of a brain coming out of Boris Johnson's head. Maybe if I said if you think you've got more in common with Boris, you're out your brain.
Learn about their pain, better yet learn to pronounce their names. Think you got more in common with Boris, you're out your brain. It's a dead cert. Before they get better, things will get worse. What can Boris say to the family of a dead nurse?
And so then the animation lifted the brain out of Boris Johnson's head. You know, as much as we'd like to do that in real life, it was not really happening.
Wow, that's interesting. So there we go. That's a perfect illustration of what you were talking about.
Wow. Yeah.
But in the comments on that video, which I was reading for the research, it's a lot of fun to watch your videos for research.
Wow.
Yeah, there was a comment by Elijah Quashi, the chicken connoisseur, as our viewers may not know. Yeah, he went viral for doing reviews of fried chicken shops in London.
Yeah,
great funny videos. But it turns out he's also a hip hop fan, and he comments on a lot of these videos. And he said of you that the commercial world is actively trying to rub him out. So there was a lot of your fans in the comments saying that the music industry has blacklisted you. So like, what's the truth in that?
Well, I mean, if we want to trace to really where it comes from, I would say during Operation Cast Lead, when the BBC refused to air the DEC appeal, I was quite harsh on Mark Thompson, who was the Director General of the BBC.
Fundraising appeal for like totally apolitical fundraising appeal for for relief in the Gaza Strip.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so I was quite clear about that when Mike Righteous then did a Fire in the Booth, and he said, I can say Free Palestine, and ironically he said I can say, and they I mean, it's actually not a laughing matter, but they censored the word Free Palestine. So obviously that set me on a collision course really with the BBC, and things had been fine before that, generally before the Operation Cast Lead stuff, but then there was a point when I was invited on Tim Westwood's radio show, and because he had gone to Camp Bastion with BBC One Extra and broadcast his show from there, it's just crude, vulgar war propaganda crap, really, from,
Yeah, so Tim Westwood was a major hip hop DJ,
a person. Yeah, well, I mean, in my mind, his contribution to the culture has just been vulgar and crude. There hasn't been much of real use to what he's done, aside from identity and the other things that some would sort of point to. But when he's going to Afghanistan and doing his show on a British military base, there's no two ways about it. The British military has been hemorrhaging soldiers. They've lost 15,000 soldiers the last few years in a row. 1 in 10 of their soldiers are foreign nationals. They're panicking. And so they send westward to this base to basically do a week of shows from Afghanistan, from occupied Afghanistan, encouraging black and brown youth to join the British Army, essentially. Now, when Jodie McIntyre, who you may remember, wrote an article condemning Westwood for this, Westwood then came out with a statement saying there's a distinction between the soldiers and the people who sent them. I went there to support the soldiers. And so when he asked me on the show, I did a bit of homework, and I found out the BBC are clearly saying the MOD cooperated with us really well on this. And I said, well, the MOD are exactly who send these soldiers. So what are you talking about, Tim? But aside from that, prior to this situation with the Afghanistan stuff, they'd asked me to go on Westwood's show in 2011. Now, I'd been excited to go on. I hadn't even noticed what the date was. Next thing I know, the fixer calls me and says, oh, no, we just have to cancel it. Like, there's just not enough time for you. Really sorry. And I'm like, okay, interesting. I later hear from an employee at One Extra that the reason they did that is because it was September 11th and they were concerned that I was going to say something dodgy on live air on Westwood's show. Now, don't forget Westwood, right, in 2010, live on air, called Akala a communist.
Did he? Bloody hell, I didn't know that.
So there's actually an ideological slant to what Tim Westwood does. Whether that's just something absorbed from the wider society or there's something more sinister to it, you really can't rule out anything, especially when you're dealing with an organization like the BBC. And Tom Mills has a great book about the BBC's history. Let's not forget that Alistair Milne was basically cooed out of the Director General role at the BBC in the Thatcher era. So it's always been a tricky organization to deal with.
Yeah, they have this long history of really blacklisting artists and really having these kind of banned lists of songs that aren't allowed on at like quote unquote sensitive times. Exactly.
I mean, and the MI5 also used to vet their employees.
Yeah.
And people were vetted for things as simple as having a family member who was a member of the SWP.
Yeah. So how is that? So all these kind of problems with the BBC. So you think it started with the BBC? So how is that like? Is that true though? That you've been sort of actively blacklisted by the record industry in general, or is this more sort of the fans, the way they're thinking of it?
Well, I mean, Akala put it this way: you would not have another person with what would be considered benign subject matter selling the amount of tickets and the amount of albums that both me and him have sold and not being signed to labels. It doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. It doesn't make sense. So clearly there's an ideological aspect to what is happening. And there just comes a time where you just have to accept it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I've already lost count of the number of books that you've cited. So, you took a break from hip hop starting in 2011. Is that right? 2012 to focus on your academic work and your activism. And you you never totally went away. You came back from time to time. But you came back fully in 2019, only a couple of years ago, with the return of Lowkey.
But really 2016.
Okay.
Really 2016. It was to deal with algorithmic disadvantaging. We kind of repackaged the return in 2019 because it was the first album release, basically. So yeah. So really 2016.
Your first album was the first album you came back with Soundtrack to the Struggle Part 2, right? Yeah, yes. In 2019, and the return of Lowkey, another video with so many views. I forget how many, but millions, right?
I think it's 1.6 million. Yeah.
But you now have your masters almost.
Yep. No, I have it.
You have your masters. So what were you doing in those years? And can you tell us more about your masters?
So I got a qualification as an English teacher. I got a qualification as a personal trainer. I worked with an organization called London to Calais, whereby we would organize convoys of people from London, mainly SOAS University, translators of many different languages, to go to Calais and work with lawyers that were there from the Islington Law Centre, from Bat Murphy, and others that were working pro bono to try and bring particularly minors, but people that were in the camp over here on the Dubs Amendment EU law, which at that time said that you had to reunite people with first degree relatives and that they could claim for asylum in a different EU country than the one they are in. And so worked on quite a few cases and as a translator, which is good, you know, in terms of progress. But
translator from Arabic, right?
What that meant was I was connecting with kind of like-minded people in that way, and it was good. But what I realized during that period was I was also getting my master's was I would just be way more useful. You know, I had built this platform and I had this voice, but yet I wasn't using it. And it sort of, I know to others it would seem so straightforward, you know, you have a responsibility now, but it really struck me. And I thought, even with the stuff that we're doing here and how useful we feel it is on a one-to-one interpersonal level, it's just a drop in the ocean of what can be done if you really embrace that voice that is there. And so then that kind of pushed me to get back into stuff in 2016. And also the industry had changed in 2016, you know. It had changed a lot.
So
how did that? Oh, go ahead.
Tell us a little bit about your masters. I mean, I think I could say I've read some of it.
Okay. When you say a little bit, I could go on for quite a long time.
Okay, give us the executive summary.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, there's a few things that I think would be relevant to this podcast. So do feel free to chop it up as much as you want to use or not use. But I am going to try and go into some of it just because I think some of it is quite, you know, it blew my mind at the time. And unfortunately, in British society, except for on Electronic Intifada or with other fellow comrades that are moved to righteous indignation by these things, there's very few places that you can even discuss most of the stuff that I studied during the masters. So I looked at the way in which Israel uses the telecommunication system for several different forms of violence against the Palestinians. I also looked at quite in depth at the war tourism or the colonialism tourism organizations that Israel has, whether it is the 7,000 lone soldiers that are in the Israeli army who are not Israeli citizens, who serve for 14 to 18 months, as we just saw recently with the killing of Ata'Allah Rayan by, I think her name, what was her name? Leanne, I forget the name of the British citizen who recently killed 17-year-old Palestinian boy in the West Bank. I looked at some of the organizations, mainly in occupied Palestine, that work on that simulatory and participatory war tourism. In terms of the phone, you know, what I found is that obviously traditional weapons are immediately discernible to the eye, whereas the phone enables and facilitates violence in a very invisible way. And it kind of is in line with the way that Moshe Dayan envisioned, one of the children of Ord Wengate, Moshe Dayan, envisioned an inconspicuous military presence after 1967 as a sort of invisible administration. And what you found is that really the landlines that were available to Palestinians prior to the Oslo era was only used by about 2% of the Palestinian population. So Oslo opened up this massive new space where Israel recognized the right of the Palestinians to operate a separate and independent communication system. However, it was qualified with a caveat that said the equipment will be used only when the independent Palestinian network is operational. So as you see throughout these periods, there's this sort of creative ambiguity that allowed for the development of a telecommunication system which is perpetually dependent on permission granted by the Israeli Ministry of Communication. And paradoxically, this promise of telecommunication sovereignty for Palestinians that was contained in Oslo II paved the way for the occupation to simultaneously increase its reach and invisibility through the establishment of a telecommunications network, which is Palestinian in name only. So the four kinds of violence that I found the phone enabled were architectural, firstly, infrastructural, secondly, which includes economic violence, and cultural and state violence also. Obviously, the architectural form of violence, there is, the famous case of the settlers that couldn't communicate with the Israeli army. So they informed the Israeli government that it was a security issue. So they needed to be able to contact the Israeli army all the time. So what Israel did with Orange was they built an antenna, which around the antenna then developed an Israeli settlement. So what we see that this need for telecommunications for settlers then leads to further settlement. So it's that way in which the phone is a sort of vehicle for that architectural violence. Obviously, we know that the situation being as it is in Area C, being 60% of the West Bank, but the Palestinians cannot build in it. So what it means is that most Palestinian companies are reliant on Israeli infrastructure that's set up in Area C. So it incurs all types of charges, and it was estimated that if the Palestinian telecommunications companies wanted to offer high levels of reception to their users in Area C, they'd have to build 330 antenna towers there. And obviously that is something that Israel will never allow them to do. In the infrastructural side of things, you see that the companies, the Palestinian companies, are obligated to apply to the Israeli Ministry of Telecommunications in order to import equipment. But since 2007, all equipment that is for which permission is granted must fulfill a dual use function, meaning not only civil, but military. And so what it means is that all telecommunications equipment, the IDF have to have access and full use of it. So what it means is that while the IDF and Motorola Israel were able to launch an encryption project called Mountain Rose, which meant that the IDF had bespoke encryption for them, meaning that their calls could not be listened to by any resistance organizations. You have simultaneously the Palestinian telecommunication could never be encrypted and was always visible to the IDF, but IDF communication could never be visible or audible, shall we say, to Palestinians. Obviously, you have the captive market side of it, whereby the population in the West Bank, in international law, Israel is prohibited from deriving economic benefit from the occupation. But we know that it's many different sectors, and the telecommunications is just one of them, where Israel does extract profit from Palestinians. The way they do this, there's several ways. There's 3 ways, in fact. So all calls made in the West Bank and Gaza through Palestinian companies have to be routed through Israel. So connection and termination charges on every call are paid by Palestinian companies to Israeli companies. Secondly, when a phone administered by a Palestinian company makes a call to a phone from an Israeli company, the Palestinian company incurs a surcharge for that call. And thirdly, due to the restrictions that were mentioned before for building in Area C, Palestinian operators are reliant on signals which are provided by Israeli companies. Also, you have the issue of Israeli phone companies which operate in the settlements, Partner, Pelephone, Golan Telecom, Hot Mobile, and Cellcom. These companies actively target the Palestinian market outside of the settlements. And so there are estimates that between 20 to 40% of the Palestinian population use these telecommunication companies for their stuff, and even the World Bank estimated that if the Palestinians were allowed to build that telecommunications infrastructure in Area C, it would add at least 48 million to the Palestinian economy. And it's also been estimated that they lose about $60 million annually from the Palestinian economy because of the way that the Israeli companies treat it as a cost-free zone. So it's sort of there's no paying tax to the Palestinian Authority, but the Israeli companies make all of this money out of the Palestinian customers. We could go on. There's much on Electronic Intifada about Unit 8200. It was a great source, actually, for my my dissertation. But also in the masters, I did get to look at this issue of the simulatory and participatory war tourism, and it's particularly ugly if you look closely at it. You've got these military bases in settlements.
Is this things like the Shirat Tadi's ultimate mission to Israel or whatever it's called?
I haven't actually gone into them. I didn't come across them. But there's, in terms of the simulatory side of it, it's organizations like Caliber 3, who are probably the biggest one, that tens of thousands of tourists pass through them every year. And
it's
what
like you get
see
to hold a real M16 and shoot at a paper target sort of thing, like a real Israeli soldier, that kind of stuff.
Well, not quite M16s, but they are given some pretty serious artillery, and they target sort of live ammunition at cutouts of elderly Palestinians in kufias. You basically see celebrities like Aerosmith and Seinfeld even visited and apparently wanted to keep their visit to Caliber 3 quite secret. But they explicitly say that what they want to do is turn the people that attend Caliber 3 into ambassadors for the state of Israel. You've also got an organization like Fontum, which what they do is they have a boot camp option, which takes groups of people on expeditions out to the occupied Golan Heights, where terrorist kidnappings are staged, where a person dressed in a dishdasha and a kufiyah comes out and takes these tourists hostage. Then the lone terrorist takes the group of people into an abandoned building where he is brought down by IDF soldiers. Now, the scary thing about Fontum is that their online marketing explicitly targets children. And, it features children being led around carrying weapons and shooting at targets. So it's in that way that Funtum basically serves as a gateway for children into later IDF recruitment by cultivating and normalizing within them this violence against the indigenous Palestinian population. You've got an organization like Zikit Extreme. Now, this is led by CEO Elkai Finn, who, according to his Instagram account, appears to have taken part in Operation Protective Edge in 2014 campaign in Gaza that left around 2,300 Palestinians dead. They claim to offer the full IDF experience, and their training supposedly is modeled on the IDF's counterterrorism course, again, featuring people supposed to be Palestinian kidnappers. Zikit, though, seems to be more focused on the use of paintball and rubber bullets rather than training with live ammunition. However, they enthusiastically offer a boot camp for kids option, including generous offers of pizza and birthday cake.
This is so
The insidious targeting of children is prominent in their promotional videos, emphasizing the fun in the systematization of violence by an army of occupation. A really interesting one, though, that took their video offline after I published an article about them is Shirev Gidon. Now, it's an organization that offers programs based in Arizona during the winter, and it's in Pennsylvania in the summer. So it's not in Israel proper, and it's not in the Palestinian territories. It's in the United States. And the reason that Jonathan Stern, who is the founder of this organization, said he didn't launch it in Israel is that it would not have been legal. Now, you see, if the video can be found somewhere online, you see a plentitude of firearms. And he claims to have trained hundreds of students. They have options in different courses, from the use of rifles, pistols, shotguns, and even Uzis. And at the beginning of every session, all of the students are dressed up in IDF uniforms, and they take part in imitation exercises of military formations and shooting at targets. And on the company website, you even have an employee at the Arizona ranch quoted as saying, quote unquote, "Every Jew has to be armed because the Goyim don't care where you live. Eventually, they are going to come for you." And that is just the participatory side of this sort of colonial tourism. That's the simulatory side. The participatory side, which is where people actually go and take part in IDF activities, is even more horrifying. Obviously, you have an organization like Mahal, who, they were formed in 1948, and many of them were former soldiers in the British Army in World War II. Some from India, some from French-speaking countries, hundreds of British, hundreds of South Africans,
Canadians too. I believe.
Canadians and Americans were in this sort of brigade, and again, they just served for 15 to 18 months. They're never in the position of being Israeli citizens. And, it's purposely targeted at people between the age of 18 and 23, and is described by the IDF as an administrative gate through which non-Israelis enlist in the military. There's other organizations we could go on forever, and I'm sure there's probably a lot of information about this kind of stuff on Electronic Intifada, but it's clear that they use to differing degrees these types of organizations as gateways through which people can claim Israeli citizenship or commit acts of violence, guilt and consequence free, and then go back into the societies that they are from. Not all of them are Jewish. So you have that also as a factor. So it's all horrific stuff, to be completely honest with you. And that's what most of my master's was spent looking at.
So, I did a story on on this a few months ago about the lone soldier programs targeting Canadians and how activists in Canada are trying to get the Canadian government to act on its own federal law that says that a foreign government cannot recruit for its military inside Canada. As always, there's an exception made for Israel. There's one here in the US. These Israeli recruitment organizations, have this very nuanced, they have these loopholes that they kind of work. Oh, no, we're not recruiting. We're just encouraging them to see for themselves Israel, and the necessary military. And if they want to join, that's their choice. But it is aggressive recruitment, and it is illegal, obviously, for an illegal occupation army. How did that time off from hip hop, delving into these this research that you did for your master's? How did that inform your work when you came back?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, in the period of time that I was away, what we have seen gradually, and partly it's due to the war in Syria, partly it's due to prevent, partly it's due to the general corporatized cultural ambience, partly it's due to algorithmic suppression of alternative forms of media, such as yourselves. Culturally, things have deteriorated massively. We were at a time in 2008, 2009, where we'd have hundreds of thousands of people on the street, deeply passionate about Palestine. And so there has been a war of attrition whereby those that stick their neck out are bashed back, even extending as far as children in schools wearing Palestinian badges being reported to Prevent, it being listed by Prevent as one of the potential indicators that someone's on the conveyor belt towards radicalization. All of that has meant that we are now, unfortunately, operating, with the algorithmic suppression in a far smaller circle of people, and it was during that heyday that organizations like Electronic Intifada and people like myself were able to build a support network of people who follow what we do. So unfortunately, you're reading about these things. It kind of lends itself to nihilism. I mean, look at all we've been through and look at all of the defeats. There's always resistance, and that's the good thing. And every day people are resisting in different ways. But they do make you pay, as definitely Asa, I'm sure, knows. They make you pay when you land blows. When you land blows, you then do suffer a consequence, whether it's just algorithmically, whether it's in terms of association, whether it's in terms of who will or won't put you on their show. And that's within the left. Like, let alone in wider mainstream British society, you pay for every single blow that you land, especially when you're breaking sort of these massive stories that Asa has done, and also Electronic Intifada in general have been, at the forefront of doing.
Let's see. It kind of speaking to that point, your track "Terrorist" was attacked on Glenn Beck's show in 2011. And also in 2011, the pro-Israel newspaper, the Jewish Chronicle, dubbed you a potential nightmare, quote unquote, because you spoke and performed at rallies against Israeli wars. What's the most ridiculous smear attack you've ever faced?
I mean, I viewed the Glenn Beck thing as an expression of love. It was just a sort of,
it's a good one,
a mangled love. In terms of the most ridiculous one was once I came back in 2016 and I was trying to get onto Fire in the Booth again. I was finding it quite difficult. So eventually I managed, I wrote a Facebook post and said, why is the DJ not responding to me? And he eventually then responded to me, and we made it happen. Now, when I went there, the producer of the show had clearly had a serious talking to, and he was sort of trying to proselytize a third way to me. So he was like,
you're not naming him, but this was Charlie Sloth. But was this when you were? Was this when he was still on One Extra?
Yeah, I mean, he was always
on
good.
The BBC.
He was always fine. This was on Radio 1, so there'd been a great trajectory for his show. But what I'm talking about is the producer for his show, who was also a nice person. I'm not trying to say he was not a nice person, and he wasn't trying to censor me. And in fact, as we'll see, he then got caught in the kind of crossfire of what happened. But he was trying to sort of impress upon me the importance of taking it easy. And he was like, look at the specials, Free Nelson Mandela. Now there's a statue of Nelson Mandela in outside the Houses of Parliament. You can play the long game. And I said, yeah, but the BBC wouldn't play Free Nelson Mandela when it came out. Like, as far as, but like,
yeah, and he was considered to be a terrorist. Exactly what you were talking about in that song.
And you couldn't even put up his picture in South Africa at that time. And of course, David Cameron was getting trips paid for by anti-sanctions group to go to South Africa. I mean, nasty stuff. But the point is that he was.
But they did get you on the show. You had a second fire in the booth.
As I had a second fire in the booth. Bless him though. I think he was put in a bit of a tough position. And he was trying to sort of calm me down. He was trying to make sure I didn't go on air and say something silly. What happened was I went on air and I said, power to victims of a globalized Cosa Nostra.
Power to victims of this globalized Cosa Nostra. Power to those dying on the shores and the borders.
Yeah, Cosa Nostra, our thing, mafia, whatever. Next thing I know, a couple of days afterwards, I got a call from the producer, and he's very, very, very anxious. And he's saying, look, I just need to ask you, man, just be honest with me. What did you say in that line? Because I've got the Jewish Chronicle going crazy at the BBC, and we've had an official complaint has been filed by the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism that you said power to victims of a globalized Kosher Nostra. I had never even heard of the phrase.
Well, they just made it up. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't scan. Like, it's ridiculous.
Apparently, it was a term that someone had used before, right?
What? Like one person on
yeah,
Twitter?
I don't know. I really don't know. But what happened
like
then
an
was
Italian Jewish bakery or something.
But then what happened was is I said to him, actually, I've put the real lyrics on my Facebook 24 hours ago, and I've written out the real lyrics. And he said, that, my friend, was an act of divine providence. He said, I'm so glad you've done that, because now they haven't got a leg to stand on. And so my lawyer then was going back and forth with them, saying, you need
with
to
the
take
Jewish
this out.
Chronicle.
Yeah. So you need to get this out of the article. There was a bit of resistance online. People were saying, what are you talking about? This is just rubbish. They've still taken that clip out and put it on the Jewish Chronicle's YouTube channel, saying that I'm saying something I'm not. But the actual article has changed to basically say, anti-Zionist rapper is welcomed onto the BBC. So regardless of that particular complaint not succeeding, all of it is part of a war of attrition to basically say, if you put this guy in front of a lot of people, we're going to give you problems.
Yeah. And I noticed as well that the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism's article about this has been deleted from their website.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because they didn't have a leg to stand on, and they probably had to,
But the misnamed Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, which is really a campaign against Palestinians, as Tony Greenstein has put it in an article for us. They were one of the main Labour anti-Semitism smearmongers, really. So, well, I mean, I think that certainly counts as one of the most ridiculous smear campaigns that I have seen. I've heard.
Just the stretching that they do to try and apply something that isn't there.
It's sad, really.
For sure.
Let's move on to another topic. In your Daily Duppy, you had a line about Rap Like I Want to Hurt You going commercial. And there's, for our US viewers, there is a hip-hop scene called drill. And it's got a lot of bad press, let's say. But a lot of these younger rappers today do seem to be talking about violent crime in their lyrics and throwing gang signs and invoking sort of imagery like that, wearing balaclavas and so forth. So what is your take on the drill scene? And do you think there's an effort by the streaming platforms to promote that kind of music? Or conversely, has drill been the victim of media demonization?
Both. I think both is the case, and both things can be true. I don't want to, one thing that I've always thought about when I think about this is you've been in a situation where hundreds of youth centres across the country have shut down, where a lot of youth workers have lost their jobs, where cuts to important services have taken place. And in a way, you could see the nihilism in the 2011 riots as an early response to what was happening. And then over that decade, while those conditions have got worse, more and more young people have embraced a kind of nihilism, right? Now, one of the things that I always think of is the painting that they shielded from Colin Powell when he made his speech at the United Nations. It was of the bombing in Spain carried out by Franco's forces and the Italian and German fascists. Now, a story about it that I always found fascinating was in Vichy-occupied France, when the painter was asked by a Nazi officer, "Did you do that?" pointing at the painting. The painter replied to him, "No, you did." Now, I think an important way to understand what has happened is it's not to remove agency from people, okay? But I have worked with young people and seen the removal of important services to them lead to a lot of bad things and a lot of bad things happening. What I was pointing to, though, was the difference between the support that somebody like a Carla would get and the support that some of these... And so what it basically says is we are okay with, to a certain extent, you engaging in fratricidal violence, but we're not okay with you questioning the pious hypocrisies of our society. So that message is given. On the other side, what was
the term that they used for your Daily Duppy YouTube controversial comment?
Shocking content.
Shocking.
There you go. That's shocking. Exactly. So that's shocking content, right? But then on the flip side of it, I'm also aware of legal precedents that have been set in terms of... So don't get it twisted. It's the corporate world that is encouraging that side of things. The government side of things is surveilling it, is infiltrating it probably, is trying to censor it. So all of that is happening at the same time. Now, obviously, since Callahan's loan from the IMF in 1979, we have governments who are allergic to regulation. It's all sectors have been deregulated. So you see a kind of out of control corporate power feeding on the nihilism and despair of communities that have been cut off from really important safety nets. And then a government that is also on top of it regulating or now regulating the individual. You know, the important thing that I always found fascinating is that at any point when hip hop music has been criticized, it's always been individualized and been about the artists. So you would never say, oh, all this misogynist Sony music. You'd never hear that said, would you?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think on that note, we're not going to single out any particular drill artist in that respect.
Absolutely not. No. I don't, because I can see a lot of vulnerability there, and it's vulnerable to many different things. And like I say, the legal precedents that are being set in terms of, and more pieces of legislation are being pursued and passed in order to squash that little space of expression. And I think it is going to get worse over the next 10 years or so, for sure. For sure. We won't be looking at the same world in 10 years as we're not looking at the same world today that we were in 10 years ago.
Yeah. I wanted to ask about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, and how, you look at the importance of artists supporting that Palestinian call and not playing shows in Tel Aviv. What's your advice to young artists who are being lured possibly by the giant offers that the Israeli government makes to play a concert there? Like, how would you speak to a young artist, a struggling artist?
Great question. I mean, Desmond Tutu has directly identified the practice of boycotting, divesting, and eventually sanctioning as integral to the process that played out in South Africa. It's believed by some that the Musicians Union in this country was the first organized bloc that banned its members from going and performing in apartheid South Africa. You had, when Bruce Springsteen and the Specials and Bob Dylan were singing about these things, they were where culture went eventually, with the passing of the act in Congress against apartheid. You saw where culture went, eventually politics kind of had to follow. Obviously, what's happened since then is another story. But the precedent is clear. It's, one of the few requests from Palestinian civil society to the rest of the world. And it's definitely the least we can do. But I also think there's another wing to it, which I think is reflected in a lot of what Palestine Action are doing at the moment, which is the direct action side of it. Because the important thing about that is, rather than the sort of, you could say BDS is a kind of a form of passive resistance. And I don't mean passive to in any way to denigrate it. It's a passive form of real resistance that has an effect. But then the direct action side of it, it flips this question of accuser and accused, because whether it's the Raytheon 9 or others who have gone through this, whenever they've gone into court, actually what it's been is an opportunity to put Israeli war crimes on trial, right, rather than the person being accused of this direct action against this factory. So I think that were we to be 10 years ago again, had we had a push like we're seeing from Palestine Action and fantastic campaigner like Huda, had you had that 10 years ago, it would have been amazing. And in a way, you had elements of it just slightly misguided in the demonstrations of 2008 and 2009. There were places that were perceived to be of Israeli interest in London that were being stopped from functioning, at least during that period. And what it's about taking that energy and that vitality that the young people have and putting it in directions that actually have material benefits and wins from them, And so I think that in terms of artists that would be offered, the problem is we are in such a dystopia. We're not educated about even the last 10 years. Asa, you have written about being among those that special branch spied on, right? If you were to say to the average person on the street, did you know that since 1968, at least 1,000 political groups of them, and we use that definition of political groups very loosely, Hedgehog Rescue Committee in Scotland, a group of vegetarians from Nottingham, Greenpeace. We're talking about organizations that loosely could be described as political in some cases. Stephen Lawrence's family was spied upon. If you were to say to the average member of the public, did you know that 1,000 political groups were infiltrated from 1968 to early 2000? They wouldn't know.
Yeah, and I think even the left don't quite realise the scale of it. That it was actually the whole political left. It was everyone from anything that can vaguely be called left wing, basically.
Yeah.
And in addition, black justice campaigns against police brutality, who were not really leftist, not particularly socialist. They were just their family members seeking justice, and they were infiltrated and spied on.
Yeah, and the reality is you can deduce from what was happening then, what's happening now, being far more developed, and and we saw it in the 2017 election. While people like us were going door to door, were mobilizing tens of people locally to register to vote, to get involved. The internal surveillance system of the Labour Party was conspiring to lose the election. Yeah. So we underestimated how malignant. It's either malignant or it's dynamic. Maybe it's both. We underestimated those functions of the establishment in this country. Yeah. And what we tried to do was the work of, frankly, 20 to 30 years in 4. And by that, I mean, we need institutions of political education, because what's happening is people are coming out of school not understanding that Britain occupied 14 million miles of the globe, not understanding that it still sits on the biggest tax evasion empire in the world, that 37% of all government losses globally through taxes come from British tax havens. Not understanding why we are all here at this time, what London is, and it's sad. Yeah. It's sad, but what it means is those of us that have spent, the better part of a decade working on this stuff, we have to improve the ways in which we're able to communicate this information.
Yeah.
And reach people. And also, we have to get off the computers too. Yeah. We can use the computers for what we have to use them for, but we have to organize locally, because we don't stand a chance. We really don't stand a chance otherwise.
Why do you think Jeremy Corbyn was able to be so successfully smeared and deposed?
There's several factors at play there. I think there was a willingness to entertain ridiculous stuff. There was a willingness to take bad faith actors as good faith actors. There, when I say the willingness, I'll be honest, even on a personal level, not really with the anti-Semitism stuff, you're depicting what was around 0.1% of the membership being accused of something, or 0.3% of the membership being accused of something, as 30% of the membership. It's not
that was
in
the
that
public
sense,
perception.
not in that sense. Yeah, that thanks to another great book that David Miller was part of. But even in terms of my own discourse about Zionism and about Israel, I found myself having to sort of disguise myself as a liberal in terms of the arguments I was making. And
what do you mean? Give an example.
Well, so I mean, you frame your arguments with international law, UN resolutions. Look, the fact is, the Palestinians are engaged in an anti-colonial struggle. That's the truth. That's the truth, and wrapping it up as not an anti-colonial struggle essentially can only lead you to a dead end.
Yeah.
Because it leads you to this sort of dictatorship of prevailing orthodoxy that says, we sit down with both sides. I mean,
right.
This kind of stuff that has been used as subterfuge to just extend what Zionism wants to do to the Palestinians. Right. And the other part of it is this sort of Martin Buberization of Zionism. Yeah. Martin Buber was a spiritual, non-state-centric Zionist. Leo Pinsker was a non-Palestine-centric Zionist. You could say, right? You could interpret them as that, okay? That was never more than tens, if 100 or so people.
Yeah, there's a real push at the moment, and it was fairly successful in the Labour Party, and now again on campuses, to sort of say, oh, well, Zionism is just, they're trying to depoliticize it almost, or
Exactly.
at least disguise it as apolitical and say, oh, well, it's just my Jewish identity. Zionism is just my Jewish identity, so therefore, by opposing Zionism, you're being anti-Semitic.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I much prefer, the kind of things that Jabotinsky and Ben Gurion were
it was
saying.
more frank.
They were saying
It's more honest.
the Palestinians are indigenous and we are colonizers.
Yeah.
And it was clear in that sense. And I think this kind of it's run amok. Really, is run amok. And 10 years ago, there was far more clarity about what was happening and what we were dealing with. I mean, internationally, people were in a far stronger position also.
Right.
You didn't have this level of servility and embrace of Israel that we've seen across the last 10 years, and particularly from the UAE. And one of the things that David Miller pointed out as well, he was pointing out 3 years ago, levels of collaboration between the UAE and Israel and stuff like this. And, we're at a terrible time, and it lends itself to nihilism as well. And it's about trying to not see a negative conclusion to almost everything happening. But again, it's by landing those blows.
I know what you mean, yeah. And, I quite like some drill, actually. So
yeah, but how could we not? How could
there's a lot of talent there.
But aside from drill, the week that Grenfell happened to me was the height of sadness and pain and the height of optimism in the same week. because it was the week after Corbyn's 2017.
It really looked
I-
for a minute there like, you know, she almost
We
lost
had
the
him.
election and he could sort of come in any month, you know?
Yeah, she was on the ropes. She was staggering on the ropes.
You know, this... Yeah.
Across the board, there could have been far more of a forthright and confrontational attitude and more clarity.
Yeah, the smear campaign that unfortunately was never called out for the smear campaign that it was. You know, this was the problem that
Exactly.
that was faced.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think that's probably a good place to end it. We don't have to end on a positive note. Like, you know, it's not we're not in a good situation, so let's just be realistic.
Yeah. No, but I'll be honest with you, it is nice. It's the first time I've felt that I'm being spoken to in an interview setting by people that I feel are on the same side. Like most of the time, it's especially with this BBC stuff, man. Like sometimes you still have to go and talk to them, but you just don't know who you're dealing with.
Yeah.
Well, you're welcome on the EI podcast anytime. Seriously.
Yeah, I mean, I think
we'll
we will have to get you back on because there's a lot more to talk
Wicked.
about.
Yeah.
And I just dropped, you know, a major point in at the end there, you know, which I at
What
the
was
last
that?
minute I didn't prepare you for. But there's a lot to talk about, you know. So yeah, it would be great.
Oh, with the Corbyn stuff. Yeah. I mean, we
Oh, go ahead.
Go on. No, I mean, we thought that we could impose it from above. We thought we could impose pro-people policies from above, from somebody who was, you know, through the vehicle of somebody that was being surveilled by the intelligence services and has been for several decades. And we thought they were just going to give us the keys to number 10. It was just never going to happen like that. You know, back to Ramsay MacDonald, the intelligence services have conspired against those that they thought would have any type of independent foreign policy in this country. You know, and that was the first Labour government.
Yeah. Wild.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, we're going to put a link to all the ways people can get in touch with you on the podcast blog post that accompanies this. You can also just follow Lowkey online at Lowkey Online, and the O in online is a 0. So Lowkey 0 in line. And you can, of course, listen to him on Spotify. We'll have all those links up. Lowkey, it's been a pleasure. And yeah, anytime you want to come back on, you are more than welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks for watching the Electronic Intifada podcast. For our audio listeners, you can now watch a video version on our YouTube channel. Please help us with the algorithm by liking our videos, leaving comments and subscribing to the YouTube channel. We need your help to beat the Silicon Valley monopolies that are suppressing news on the battle for justice in Palestine. You can also support us by sharing our videos on social media and writing reviews on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio podcasts. You can donate to fund our journalism by visiting our website, electronicintifada.net. Then click Donate Now. You can give one-off contributions or become a regular funder. Thank you.